Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Jonny Steinberg, a South African writer and scholar from the University of Oxford. He is at Yale as a visiting scholar in the Council on African Studies at the MacMillan Center. Professor Steinberg is the author of several books that explore South African people and institutions in the wake of the transition to democracy. Two of them, Midlands, about the murder of a white South African farmer, and The Number, a biography of a prison gangster, won South Africa's premier nonfiction award, the Sunday Times Alan Paton Award. Today we'll talk with Professor Steinberg about his book project on Nelson and Winnie Mandela's marriage. Welcome, Professor Steinberg.
Thanks, Marilyn.
Let's begin with an overview of the project. Tell us about it.
Well, it's about South Africa's most famous and iconic marriage, probably between its two most recognized people. Both larger than life, both played formidable roles in recent South African history and were married to one another. And I guess the premise of the book is that what happened in their marriage and what happened in their respective public careers is very closely connected. So it's an exploration of a marriage and two political lives and how they grew from one another.
Now, I know you've looked at a lot of different people and institutions in South Africa and have written books about some of them. So I'm curious what led you to Winnie and Nelson.
Quite different to anything I've written before. I've usually written about ordinary anonymous people and tried to tell big stories through ordinary lives. And in a way, this is the opposite. This is to try to show how the small textures in life emerge from what big people have done. So in a sense, it's an inverse of what I've always done before, and a challenge that I'm looking forward to.
But what struck in your mind? Okay, I'm going to look at their marriage. How did you get to that point? I'm curious.
Well, at the beginning, I was actually embarking upon a book about Nelson Mandela only. And a short way into the research realized that it was quite difficult to tell a story about him without also telling a story about her. From his perspective and the perspective of his politics and his career, I think that his marriage to her was formative and shaped so much about what he did in the world. And realizing that the marriage was so much part of the story, it dawned on me that I should write a book about the marriage. She's also, an enormously controversial figure, but an extraordinary figure.
Yes.
Probably the best known South African woman. And I wanted to give her story its due. I didn't just want to tell a story about him. I thought that for a number of reasons, the story about the marriage was the right one.
Right. And how do you get at the research? Because obviously a marriage is a very private kind of thing. How do you get into that to see what their marriage was really like? What are you doing to kind of do the research?
Well, one very important source are the letters that they wrote to one another. He was in jail for 27 years, and during that time of separation, they wrote to one another a great deal. And letters are not a transparent window into what somebody is feeling or into a relationship, but they tell you a great deal. And some of those letters are immensely powerful. Some of them are some of the greatest love letters ever written, between two people who were passionately in love. They were only together a short time. They met in 1957, married a year later. 3 years later, he was on the run and in hiding and then in prison.
Right.
And so there were these 3 years of passion and romance, which were receding into memory, into history. They were thinking about them all the time, more and more nostalgically, more and more idealistically. And all of this is contained in this very powerful correspondence. So that's one source.
Right.
Another are, I'm looking for all the remaining people who knew them at every stage of their marriage, from when they met in the late 1950s. They were both very striking, very beautiful people. He was a very famous person. When they got together, it caused a splash. They were treated like celebrities in a way that no other South African political figure ever was. They really they were the beginnings of political celebrity, of real glamour, and people remember them very vividly. Also talking to all the remaining people who were in prison with Nelson Mandela, and the dozens, perhaps hundreds of people who came into contact with Winnie and knew something of her personally during the years that Nelson was in prison. So lots and lots of work to do.
Okay, so I know you open with their courtship, and they basically told the same story of how they met, but you seem to think there is some deception there. So let's talk about that a little bit. Their story versus the reality.
Well, it's amazing that by the end of their lives, they disagreed on almost everything. But one of the few things they agreed on was how they met, and the story that they agreed upon wasn't entirely true. The story that they both told was a very classically gendered story of an older, powerful man and a young, naive, and beautiful woman. He was 38 when they met. He was a lawyer. At that stage, there were only 60 black lawyers in South Africa. It was a big deal to be a lawyer. And he was also increasingly becoming the most famous anti-apartheid activist in the country. He drove a very flashy, flamboyant car, a green Oldsmobile. He wore very, very expensive tailored suits. He was a great public figure. She was much younger than him. She was 22 years old. She had just come to Johannesburg, having had a rural upbringing. And she was stupendously beautiful. That's what everybody remembers about her. And the story is of an older man seducing a younger woman. He fell for her beauty, she fell for his power, and an old gendered story rolls on. But if you look at the letters that he was writing to her from prison 10 years later, you can see that something else was actually going on. At one point he says, "I don't know if I'm free to remind you of this, but you actually courted me. You went after me." In other letters, one discovers that she was seeing somebody else at the same time, was playing the two men off each other. So she was a much more savvy, powerful, self-confident person than the old story suggests. And it seems as if something very special was happening between them, which they perhaps didn't have the words for. And that was the idea of a marriage as itself being a spectacle, a political spectacle. And you have to transport yourself back to 1950s South Africa to see the enormous political import, the political power of seeing two well-heeled, enormously confident, beautiful black people together. It sent a political message which they understood, and which many others perhaps didn't. So I think even in these very, very earliest years, they were forging a political partnership, and it was hidden by the old gendered story that they told.
Do you think that they knew that from the very first beginnings, that they would be held as an example?
I think it was more a question of intuition and instinct than real knowledge that this would become the country's most famous and important political marriage. I think that they both just had an intuitive sense of political celebrity and its deep seriousness and its deep importance, and that's part of what drew them together.
So let's characterize their marriage for us. I mean, they spent 30 years apart, 3 years initially together, then 30 years apart. I'm curious how you sustain that kind of marriage. Was she able to visit him at all in prison?
Well, at the beginning, the contact between them was very restricted. She didn't see him at all for the first couple of years. Then she was only allowed to visit him every 6 months, very, very briefly, in circumstances where warders were listening in on their conversations and watching them. They were permitted to write to each other, but very short letters, and which censors would read first. So for many, many years, there was no contact between them in privacy at all. And the result is that they often had to speak to one another in code. And part of my work is to try and decipher this code and get a sense of what they were really saying to one another. One of the most interesting was about fidelity. He became aware fairly early that she was sleeping with others and had to decide how to respond to this.
But that was not public knowledge, I imagine.
Well, it was the subject of a great deal of gossip in the liberation movement. Many people around them were speaking about it. The security police made sure that he knew. They wanted to hurt him. They wanted him to know anything that might damage him. And there are a couple of letters where you can see him subterraneanly, way sort of between the lines, saying, I understand that you're a young woman and that I'm away indefinitely, but let us remain committed to one another politically. You can always almost see the sublimation happening, as sexual fidelity being replaced by political fidelity.
Right.
I don't think he was ever comfortable with it, but I think that he understood it.
Right, right. And I am curious, so if that is going on and there's gossip about their marriage and he is still in prison, what was it like in South Africa in terms of that partnership? How was the outside world looking at their marriage?
Well, what became of their marriage was really Winnie's doing. She could have disappeared into obscurity.
Mm-hmm.
The South African government made her life absolute hell. Mm-hmm. She'd put her children in school and they'd put pressure on the headmaster to expel them. She had a career as a social worker. They banned her, which restricted her movement to such an extent that she had to give up her job. So she lost her livelihood. She lost her capacity to put her children in school. She very bravely started underground work, and they caught her for that and threw her in prison. She was in solitary confinement. She was in prison altogether for 18 months, in solitary confinement for about 9 months of that. She was beaten, tortured. And the more they went after her, the stronger she became. Mm-hmm. And by the late 1970s, she was a quite unique figure. She was the only figure inside the country who could say, I'm a member of the ANC, I can talk for the ANC. Everybody else was in exile or in prison. Mm-hmm. And she kept his memory alive. So in a way, the marriage became as famous as it was largely due to her courage, due to her continual recognition that their marriage was an enormously powerful symbol and that she would keep putting herself and the marriage out there. Mm-hmm. She carried it for many years.
And they did have 2 children.
They did have 2 children, and their lives were also made incredibly difficult by these circumstances. In 1977, Winnie was banned. The police arrived at her house one night, threw all her worldly possessions on a truck, and drove her off into a remote town in the middle of nowhere where she didn't speak the local language. She was given a small 2-roomed house. And one of her kids went to live with her in those circumstances, then went off to boarding school. So the kids had to watch, both of their parents being imprisoned, mm-hmm. one of their parents being banished, being separated from them all the time so they could be educated. It was a very, very difficult childhood for both of them.
Yes, a very difficult life for all of them. So when Nelson got out of jail, what happened?
Well, there'd been a great deal of controversy around Winnie in the 2 years preceding Nelson's release from prison. She defied her banning order to Brandfort, this rural town that she went to, and went back to Soweto, to her home, at a time when there were uprisings across South Africa against apartheid, and the epicenter was in Soweto. Mm-hmm. And she went back into the thick of that and said things and did things that were enormously controversial.
Right.
And in the year preceding his release, Mandela was really faced with a choice about whether to be loyal to her or whether to distance himself from her, mm-hmm. and took this decision to stand by her. And when he walked out of prison on the 11th of February 1990, it was holding her hand. And they both showed their fists to the world. They were together, they were united and strong. Mm-hmm. And then their marriage unraveled over the following 2 years.
Right, it was short-lived.
Yeah, and I guess that's, given all that had happened over the previous 3 decades and their very limited capacity to come together and talk things through and work things out, in a way it's not surprising. They'd both been through 1,000 lifetimes.
Right.
They'd been through the extraordinary. They'd both lived and experienced such extreme lives. Mm-hmm. And when he was released, they had to move straight into the limelight. They were both working 18, 20 hours a day, living at a very high level, very hard for a relationship to survive.
Right, right. I mean, the separation and then the intense scrutiny, I would imagine, would be tough for any marriage. Yeah. I am wondering, because they did end up divorcing, as you had said, their values kind of also grew apart too. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's common to say that their political values are now directly opposed to one another. Mm-hmm. Nelson Mandela is famous for forgiveness, for reconciliation, and for saying, we know what happened in the past, but if we're going to build a future, we have to find a way of putting it behind us. Winnie is famous for saying that she doesn't forget any of the hurt, that she hasn't forgiven any of the hurt, and that she will not. So yes, in a sense, their political values drifted. Mm-hmm. I think the fact that they're both speaking to an eternal question, which is, what do you do about the past? Do you forgive what happened there? You know, that's a question that we all face all the time, and that's what they addressed. And I think that as a result, they'll both be remembered for a long time. They were both speaking to a universal, eternal question, and maybe an unanswerable question. And they both gave such definitive, such powerful answers. And the sense that these two opposing answers were housed in one marriage, and in what happened between two people, makes it a very attractive marriage to write about. Attractive marriage for somebody who writes about politics to write about.
Right, right. And after they divorced, did they still work together on some level politically?
No, they became increasingly estranged. You know, when Nelson Mandela became president in May 1994, Winnie Mandela was given a junior position in cabinet, but was fired from it quite quickly. And from there on, they drifted further and further apart. After Nelson died, Winnie became very close to the leaders of a new radical populist opposition movement. So she remained a member of the ANC, but an increasingly skeptical one.
So what do you think their partnership's mark left on South Africa?
Well, in a sense, you know, they bookend the unfinished business, the unfinished controversies of the way apartheid ended. In South Africa today, you know, there's an enormous debate which grows fiercer every day about whether the ANC conceded too much, about whether white people got away with too much. And in a sense, those two are emblems of that very, very live debate, which it's probably a debate that will last for another generation or two, and they will keep symbolizing it.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being here with us and sharing your work.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.
For more information about Professor Steinberg and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.